Thank you, Arushi. Hello and welcome to uh, all the people who are watching us on Facebook and here on Zoom. I welcome you all on behalf of the Department of History, University of Delhi. And our today's guest speaker is Dr. Sajjad Rizvi, who is Associate Professor of Islamic Intellectual History and the Director of Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter. He has published extensively on philosophy in the wider Persianate world in the Safavi Mughal period. His research interests, which grew from his PhD at Cambridge University on the philosophy of Mullah Sadr Shirazi, lie in the post-Avicennian philosophical, theological, and mystical traditions. His second main area of interest is Quranic exegesis and textual hermeneutics. Currently, he is completing projects on the broad sense of philosophy in Safavi Iran, the development of philosophical tradition in Iran and North India in the 18th century, and philosophy in contemporary Muslim world as part of a contribution to global philosophy. Dr. Rizvi will be speaking today on the topic, Two Schools of Metaphysics in Islamic Philosophy and Their Inheritance in 18th Century Northern India. Without any further delay, please go ahead, sir.
If I can quickly add, Sajjad, to welcome you. This is an important occasion for us in the history department that you are speaking for two reasons. One is that the necessity in terms of our exposure to interdisciplinary research, that as history department, we are interested in collaboration with other departments in social sciences and humanities. So we learn from religious studies department, philosophy department. And also as a scholar located abroad, we are very much interested in, international exchange of academic programs, etc. So which is an important interest, area of interest for us also. So both ways of exposure to interdisciplinary research and also collaboration with foreign institutions. Your talk is, of much interest to us. So maybe we look forward to hear from you.
Thank you, Rizvi, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you to those who are tuning in. It's very much a pleasure, and my only regret is that I cannot actually be there with you. I miss Delhi. I haven't been there for 12 years now, I think it is. It's been a very long time, and I would certainly love to return and see how we can, as you mentioned, develop research collaboration and exchange between our universities in the future in this area and other areas. And I'm certainly happy to have that conversation with fellow historians. I am, as you know, by training, a historian, much more than someone who's in the study of religion or even in the study of philosophy. So thank you for that invitation. Let me just say a couple of things about why I think this sort of conversation on this topic is important before I start sort of reading a paper, not necessarily reading a paper as such, but certainly reading from the argument that I'm developing on this. The first reason why I think this conversation about the study of metaphysics in North India is important is because it is significant for us to try and reinscribe what I would call the Hindustani contribution. I sometimes struggle with this term, South Asian. We're basically talking about pre-independence intellectual traditions in North India. So I will use the shorthand, maybe Hindustani, to refer to that. Contributions and debates in Islamic intellectual history. So to a large extent, the Hindustani experience has become a bit of a neglected orphan in this area. Neglected orphan in the sense that there is sometimes, when you look around, very little interest in philosophical and philosophical theological traditions within the sphere of contemporary Hindustan. And yet there is an awareness of a very significant intellectual inheritance, which comes from, what is, of course, known as the Dars-e-Nizami, this famous kind of pedagogy or set of texts and textual practices which were established in the middle of the 18th century and then flourished for at least about 100 years in the culture primarily of certain qasbas in the north, as well as some other spheres of what one might call kind of Nawabi culture in places like Arcot, in parts of Bengal and other places. So there's this very strong history of the maqulat, as they're called, the rational sciences, including things like philosophy and logic within the Dars-e-Nizami. A second reason why this reinscription of Hindustani contributions is important within the wider course of Islamic intellectual history is that there is a very strong, as we all know, Arabocentric bias in the study of Islam, that things are normatively Islamic if they are Arabic, and even within that sometimes there is a bias towards a neglect of areas such as philosophy and logic, because they are not considered to be core areas in the study of Islam. And I guess the third reason why this reinscription of the Hindustani contribution is important is because even when we consider things like philosophy, just as in the wider study of Islam, we're interested nowadays in, there's a recent article called Provincializing Mecca, which was, about challenging the Arabocentric bias. Similarly, one might argue that there should be an attempt to provincialize Isfahan, by which I mean, perhaps not overdo our emphasis on Iran as the center of intellectual inquiry, and also think about the reception of that and the development and the debates which subsequently took place, as I mentioned, in Hindustan. That's one broad set of reasons why I think this conversation is important. The second one relates to my own interest in the development of what we might call global philosophy, or some sets of considerations towards a comparative philosophy. And within that, I think it is important to consider what we mean by philosophy, what we mean by metaphysics, how debates occur and are conducted in different cultural and linguistic contexts, including those in Hindustan. And for that contemporary set of arguments that are taking place, about the very notion of philosophy, which I am interested in. And I have been conducting a number of conversations, part of a project on contemporary philosophy in the Muslim world, with colleagues in Turkey, in Iran, in Iraq, and in Pakistan at the moment, and that will hopefully extend to other parts of the world, hopefully even to India. There is an important reason why we need to take into consideration the history of those traditions. So why is it important for us to engage with arguments in the 18th and 19th century? Partly because they constitute a mode of us making sense of the inheritance and the formation of key concepts and ideas that we still continue to use today. Now, of course, this in itself is, you could say, within the method of intellectual history. In Western academia, this is very much consistent with the ideas of, say, Alistair McIntyre on the notion of tradition and how it is that we need the history to help us make sense of the language and the terminology that we use for areas in philosophy, such as ethics, such as philosophy of the mind, such as metaphysics, as well as Quentin Skinner's ideas about the context in which texts are produced and reproduced and perpetuated. But it's very much also part of the Hindustani tradition itself. My colleague and friend Asad Ahmed, who is at Berkeley, who I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, is about to publish a book on particularly looking at the logic tradition within the Dars-e-Nizami. And in that he has this concept of what he calls these texts and this tradition as being palimpsests of themselves. So there's a sense in which there's a layering of ideas and debates going on within the tradition. And there's a very conscious way in which the commentary culture on certain texts, the production of what are known as hashiyas, of marginal notes and commentaries, makes an effort to excavate the various layers of the historical debates on these issues, so that we get a much fuller picture of how certain sets of issues have arisen and developed within that tradition. So that sort of historical approach to the study of these philosophical texts within the Hindustani tradition, I think is an important thing for us to bear in mind as we seek to move towards more global and comparative notions around philosophy. So I thought it would be useful just to make those two preparatory kind of remarks about why I think this this conversation is important. Now, in terms of what I want to primarily talk about today is I will make some introductory remarks about the Dars-e-Nizami and the sorts of philosophical formations that we see in the 18th and 19th century. And then I will say something about, in particular, the two schools that I'm referring to. And these are the schools, of course, of two important Safavid thinkers, Mir Muhammad Baqir Damad, who dies in 1631 and was towards the end of his life Shaykh al-Islam in Isfahan, and a very significant philosopher of that period. He was also a very important jurist, by virtue of the fact that he was Shaykh al-Islam of Isfahan. And his student, Malasadas Shirazi, who I've worked on most of my academic career, who dies in 1636, and whose works were known in India within about 50 years of his passing. In fact, both the works of Damad and Malasadas were extensively known by around 1700 in India, and were extensively cited and critiqued and debated and developed from the 18th century onwards. And so in that sense, a discussion of these two schools, or these sets of doctrines associated with these two individuals, is quite important for us to make sense of how it is that the study of philosophy developed, particularly in the Dars-e-Nizami, in the Hindustani context. Now, and then within that also, I will say something about the particular kind of case study I'm looking at is their conception of metaphysics, and how they constitute two rival conceptions of metaphysics, two opposing concepts of metaphysics, which are very much rooted in a reception of Ibn Sina, of Avicenna, the famous early philosopher who dies in 1037, arguably the first major Islamic philosopher, and certainly one who had an extensive influence both in Latin scholasticism, but of course very significantly in Islamic philosophical traditions all the way up to the modern period. You, for example, still have people who would describe themselves as Avicennians in the 20th century and beyond. And you certainly had major commentaries and works of the Avicennian tradition being written even in the 20th century. One thinks of Muhammad Saleh Mazandarani's Hikmat Abu Ali, which was written in the 1940s, as well as people writing hashiyas, for example, on the metaphysics of Ibn Sina's Shifa, even in the 2000s, quite recently in Iran. And certainly within the vestiges of the Dars-e-Nizami in Hindustan, even after independence, you do have the odd glimpse here and there of people debating and picking up issues in the work of Ibn Sina, whether it's in the logic or the metaphysics. Now, just to say something more about the conceptions of what the Dars-e-Nizami is and the sort of texts that were studied in the Dars-e-Nizami before I move to the two schools. one of the important things to think about is how texts were established as being central to that pedagogy. What sort of areas were particularly of interest in the maqulat within the so-called rational sciences. So there seems to have been quite a large emphasis on logic texts and on what would have been called natural philosophy in that period, but what we nowadays would call physics. So ideas around bodies, properties of bodies, whether those bodies are celestial or corporeal entities of this world, as well as how that set of intellectual concerns was then supplemented and complemented by the way in which Sufi metaphysics was present in those milieu. And by Sufi metaphysics in this context, in the 18th century context, we're primarily talking about the so-called school of Ibn Arabi and the metaphysics of monism of the school of Ibn Arabi, which was prevalent in Sufi circles amongst Chishtis and others. And one very important element of that was the way in which that Sufi metaphysics was in a process of encounter and conversation with certain Indian traditions, particularly the traditions of Yoga Vedanta, and we know of course a number of Persian works which were written in the 17th and the 18th century, which examine the way in which one can compare the metaphysics of, say, the Yoga Vedanta school, and I'm taking them together as a singular school because they often were in this context seen as connected, and how that relates to the metaphysics of the school of Ibn Arabi. So we're all familiar with, for example, the work of Dar al-Shukr, the Majma al-Bahrain as it is. We're familiar with Abdul Rahman Chishti's work. We're also familiar, of course, significantly with the Masnavis of Mirza Abdul Qadir Bedil and other poets. And within this context, let me just mention one other text, which I am actually working on with a friend of mine, Sayyid Nizamuddin Ahmed. We're editing a text which was produced in Arabic in India, probably by an Iranian emigre. The text is called Al-Bawariq al-Nuriya. Most of the manuscripts which survive are from India, from North India, from the Hindustan context. And while this is a work of Arabic, it has certain elements in Persian. The work demonstrates quite an interesting knowledge of the Yoga Vedanta tradition, and compares sort of Sanskrit terms for elements of metaphysics and elements of the theory of the metaphysics of the human soul with concepts in Arabic and in Persian on those. And generally, it's a wonderfully interesting text which talks about the metaphysics, but towards the end also has a section on the theory of what in the Central Asian Sufi context is known as the lataif, or the subtle centers or substances of the soul, and what in various Indic traditions, I guess one would call the chakras, which relate to subtle centers of the human person. So there is that very rich kind of Sufi metaphysics, which is also part of the milieu, which runs parallel in many ways to the way in which the maqulat in and of themselves worked. Now, in terms of the actual text and the formation of the Dars-e-Nizami, this is something I've written on. A number of other people have written on that, so that we don't need to necessarily rehearse the history of how this came about. But I just want to indicate maybe some of the key texts which are part of that. So there's two elements to it. One is the commentaries, the key commentaries, and what you would call the school texts that were studied, or elements of the school texts that were studied. If one wanted to be well trained in philosophy, what did one study? And alongside that, there were the what you might call the original works, works which were written to really kind of encapsulate what the metaphysics or the metaphysical debates of the time were, which were significant, that someone trained in the maqulat had to be familiar with. So in terms of the texts that were commented upon and that were extensively studied and which were inherited primarily from a tradition which emerges out of Shiraz in the 15th century, and to a certain extent places like Samarkand also in the 15th century, making its way to Delhi and Agra, and then ultimately to Lucknow in particular through the Dars-e-Nizami. First of all, you've got certain logic texts. So you've got, for example, the Isagoge of Athir ad-Din al-Abhari, who dies in 1265, who was a very important Avicennian thinker and systematizer of Avicennian philosophy. And his Isagoge, as the term suggests, is a way in which one can understand logic, but also one can understand logic as a mode for connecting language and the way in which we construct propositions and the way in which we try to render meaning with our understanding of metaphysics and the world as it is. So in that sense, the Isagoge is not just about areas of philosophy, but it's really how we connect entities which are independent of our minds, concepts within our minds, within the mind, and also the terms that we use to express those concepts and link them to entities which are extramental. You have the Tahdhib al-Mantiq of the Central Asian logician Sa'd-ud-Din Taftazani, who dies in 1389. And this was primarily studied through a commentary by Jalaluddin Davani, who's one of the key thinkers in the Shirazi tradition in the 15th century, but especially through a number of very important Indian glosses. So starting with Mir Zahid Hiravi, Mir Zahid, who seems to have been a judge in the Mughal military under Aurangzeb, wrote a number of very important hashiyas, marginal commentaries on both metaphysics and on logic texts, which were then central to that later tradition. Then, of course, you have the Risala Shamsiya, which is a very short summary of logic produced by Qutbuddin Razi Tahtani in 1360, who died in 1365. And again, that's usually studied through various commentaries, particularly the commentaries of Gerjani and Davani from the Shiraz school in the 15th century. And again, for the Dars-e-Nizami, primarily mediated through the gloss, the marginal commentary of Mir Zahid. So in logic, those are probably the three most important works. And then you have the works which were then studied in the area of metaphysics. And within metaphysics, we're primarily talking about something which is known as Umur Amma. So Umur Amma in the Arabic tradition relates to the general properties of being, or the general properties of existence. There are things like the one and the many, the general and the particular, the eternal and the temporal, the cause and the effect, and so forth. Sort of general abstract metaphysical properties that can be associated with entities. And within that, there were a number of texts which were absolutely central. One which in some ways you would think indicates the school of Malasadas, which I'm going to come to later, was the Sharh al-Hidayah of Malasadas himself. Commonly in the Dars-e-Nizami, this was known as the Sadra itself, and even until fairly recently, those who are familiar with the Dars-e-Nizami would call it the Sadra. And this is his commentary on Abhari, who I mentioned earlier, his Hidayat al-Hikmah, which is a short introduction basically to metaphysics, physics, and conception of the sciences, which draws very much on Avicenna. The Sadra was perhaps the most important text in the study of metaphysics within the Dars-e-Nizami, and that is in some ways evidenced not only by the very many manuscript copies that were produced in Hindustan of this text, but also of the very many commentaries and glosses written on it. At one point, I think I counted well over 100 commentaries on the Sadra of different parts of the text. Many of them tend to be on the physics or the natural philosophy. And in terms of the early publication of the text, so we know in the 19th century when lithographs of these texts started to be produced in large numbers, whether in Lucknow, Kanpur, Delhi, or even Bombay, there are at least 10 different lithographs of the Sadra which were produced in that period, often with different marginal notes by significant figures in the Dars-e-Nizami, arising out of Lucknow, arising out of course, the Farangi Mahal, which is very much the heart of the Dars-e-Nizami and the network of the Dars-e-Nizami. There are two other texts in metaphysics, which I thought I would just mention on the school texts, which become important through commentaries. One is actually a text in philosophical theology. It's the Sharh al-Mawakif of Gerjani, again a Shirazi thinker from the 15th century. The reason why the Sharh al-Mawakif was important for the Dars-e-Nizami was that the first section of that text is on the Umur Amma, which I discussed just previously, the section which deals with the abstract properties of entities and of existence. And this was primarily studied through the gloss of Mir Zahid again, which was extremely significant. And there are very many super glosses and super commentaries written by figures in the Dars-e-Nizami on that text. And then the final text in metaphysics, which seems to have been studied at least to a certain extent, but perhaps not as much as I previously claimed in an article published about 10 years ago. And this is reflective of the school that I'm going to discuss, and that's the Al-Ufuq al-Mubin of Mir Damad. There is some evidence that this was studied in the Khairabad school, which is kind of a parallel and a continuation of the Farangi Mahal milieu of the Dars-e-Nizami. Al-Ufuq al-Mubin is Mir Damad's own kind of textbook for the teaching of metaphysics. It's one of his very many unfinished works. It's a huge work. In the modern critical edition, it goes to about 600, 700 pages. The edition which was produced in Iran about 10 years ago. And we have certain glosses which are extant by members of the Khairabad school, primarily by Fazl Haq and later Abdul Haq Khairabadi. And the interesting thing about Al-Ufuq al-Mubin and also these other works which are in metaphysics is often because they're being studied by people who are also engaged in logic and in other areas, you get debates in metaphysics which are then cited in and used within debates in logic, debates in kalam, in theology, debates in Quranic exegesis, and so forth. So you find particularly Al-Ufuq al-Mubin's ideas around the reference of the term existence or exist coming up in debates about the reference of real terms in propositions in discussions of logic, particularly on the commentary tradition of the logic text that I mentioned before. So alongside these kind of textbooks, which were very much, inheritances from the Iranian tradition coming into Hindustan, you then had works which are produced either before the real sort of establishment of the Dars-e-Nizami or then after it. And here we're talking about basically 4 texts. The first one is pre kind of Dars-e-Nizami, and this is Ash-Shams al-Bazigha by Mullah Mahmud Jaunpuri, who died in 1652. This is someone who I've written on before. And it's a relatively short text, which is primarily concerned with natural philosophy. But one of the reasons why it's important is because he debates within this text Mir Damad's famous solution to the problem of creation. Mir Damad comes up with an attempt to reconcile the so-called philosophical position, which is that creation is not something which happens in time, but rather it is the ontological separation, so to speak, between the cause and the effect. So the cosmos as such is eternal, is co-eternal with God as its principle, but it is separated by the very fact of its contingency. And the kind of theological doctrine, I guess, which would be that, which gives a greater role to divine freedom and volition to create and to create in time. So these concepts are on the one hand known as Huduth Dhati in the Avicennian tradition, and the other one is Huduth Dhamani. And of course, Mir Damad famously comes up with this concept that he calls Huduth Dahri, which is that the incipience of the cosmos happens in this median space, which is known as Dahr, which is neither eternal fully nor entirely temporal. And this is a theory which Mahmud Jaunpuri famously critiques in Ash-Shams al-Bazigha. Then you have a number of other works. The 2 other works which are specifically on metaphysics are Al-Ujala al-Nafi'a. Al-Ujala al-Nafi'a was written by the son of the founder of the Dars-e-Nizami, Abd Ali Bahr al-Ulum, as he's known, Bahr al-Ulum, of course, because of his great learning. He was a very important itinerant figure. He had the patronage of people of rulers in Lucknow, and then later in Shah Jahanpur, and then in Arcot and other places. He ends up in Arcot under the Nawab Walaja. Ujala Nafi' is primarily concerned with the conception of metaphysics and of the Umur Amma, the general properties of being. Then you have Al-Urwat al-Wuthqa, which is by Kamal-ad-Din Sihalvi. Kamal-ad-Din Sihalvi, who dies in 1761, was kind of like Bahr al-Ulum's uncle. He's sort of a cousin of Mullah Nizamuddin, as well as being perhaps one of Mullah Nizamuddin's best students. So it was also very popular in the various learning circles outside of the center in Farangi Mahal in Lucknow. But what it also demonstrates again is the concern with certain key notions around what metaphysics is, what the conception of philosophy is, what the scope of metaphysics is. And then the final text, which is kind of produced in this milieu, which represents the debates of these 2 schools, again is a work primarily in natural philosophy or physics, and this is Al-Hadiyya Sa'idiyya by Fazl Haq Khairabadi, the famous philosopher who died on the Andaman Islands in 1861 because he was accused, of course, of being involved in the mutiny, the war in 1857. And this was a work written for the Nawab of Rampur, Sayyid Ali Khan, and it's primarily, as I mentioned, a work in natural philosophy or physics. And I think there is an interesting argument to be made about why, alongside the metaphysics, why is there such an interest in the physics within the Dars-e-Nizami? And it's not perhaps such a straightforward question that we can answer. There are attempts to answer this by looking at the context of different philosophical traditions which were prevalent in Hindustan at this time. But I think one of the points which could be made is that the function of the maqulat was not just narrowly to produce religious scholars in the way perhaps we conceive of the Dars-e-Nizami in the post-independence period especially, but it was really to train people in what was considered to be the best education of its time, and especially train people who could be useful in imperial service, whether this was Mughal imperial service or whether it was the service of the successor states after them. And for that, it's quite clear that the study of physics and related areas was important, because it was considered to be a way to make sense of the nature of the reality that we inhabit. And that would then be a very useful, practical almost complement to understanding the metaphysical foundations of that. So anyway, that was a very quick sort of run through some of the texts and the actual content, in a sense, of the Dars-e-Nizami, so that we understand how those inheritances which were coming from Iran were then being developed, and what emphases they had, what specific interests and directions they were taking. And all of these texts that I've mentioned did have their own sets of glosses, but especially the core texts, the commentaries that were then being further commented upon earlier, the works of Malasadas, of Mir Damad, of Gerjani, and so forth. So now we come to the first of the two schools which I want to briefly mention, and this is that of Mir Damad, who as I said, was the Shaykh al-Islam of Isfahan towards the end of his life, possibly under Shah Abbas I, but certainly under his successor, his grandson, Shah Safi. Now, it might be an exaggeration to talk about a school of Mir Damad, especially when we're talking about North India or Hindustan. I made that claim, as I mentioned briefly, in an article I published about 10 years ago, and perhaps I need to qualify that somewhat. There certainly is a school of Mir Damad with respect to the Iranian tradition. So he had, of course, his students, and he had a number of individuals who continued to defend his conception of metaphysics, and especially his theory of creation well into the late 19th century in the Iranian context. In Hindustan, as I've already mentioned, you had Mullah Mahmud Jaunpuri in the 17th century, who arguably was a student, perhaps, of Mir Damad, although I'm not sure we can necessarily verify this, who, of course, rejected it. And there were a number of others who mentioned it and rejected it in the later Dars-e-Nizami traditions, especially amongst the Khairabadis. But there were certain areas that they took up in terms of their metaphysics. And in particular, I would say that there's one kind of general area of Mir Damad's metaphysics which were considered to be very significant for these debates, both within metaphysics, but also within the metaphysical implications of the way in which reference of terms in propositions works in the logic. And this was Damad's idea that when we consider the concept of existence and the term exist or existence, we are primarily concerned with the notion of a quantifier. Now, what I mean by this, in a sense, is if we were to place this within the Kantian tradition, we're basically making the claim that existence is not a real predicate. And this was very much opposed to the Avicennian tradition, the early Avicennian tradition, which comes through Nasiruddin Tusi, and it was also the position which was later rejected by Malasadas. So for Malasadas, existence is very much a real predicate. Existence is more than a quantifier. It is the fundamental feature of everything that is. For Mir Damad, if you say, for example, X exists, or if you say, as the scholastics would say, Amr exists, or Zayd exists, all you are saying is that there is a Amr or there is a Zayd in extramental reality and nothing else. It's just merely picking out an item. It's quantifying that item in extramental reality. You're not saying anything. You're not adding anything to the sense of that entity that you are referring to. Whereas for someone like Sadr, there is something that you are referring to. You're making certain claims about the qualities of and the properties of that thing. And that went alongside his own reading of Avicenna or Ibn Sina, which was that Ibn Sina was primarily an essentialist. For him, it was essences which were the primary building blocks of reality. And when we talk about existence as something which is fundamental and which is the ground of existence and of being, then we're only and exclusively talking about God. That was very much Mir Damad's position. Only God is wujud in a meaningful sense. And when we use wujud to refer to entities in extramental reality, we're just picking them out and we're quantifying them. I think that was a very important emphasis that Mir Damad had in his metaphysics, which was then, as I said, taken up by various elements of the debates that one finds in the Dars Nizami. Now, alongside that, you have this broad conception of umur amma, or the general properties of existence, which were developed in Al-Ufuq al-Mubin by Mir Damad, and which then become part of the fabric of the debates within the works of the Nizami. So in terms of, this is partly about the structure of the Umur Amma, and it's also partly about the scope of Umur Amma. Now, what I mean by this is that when we look at Mir Damad's work, we are developing a conception of Umur Amma, or general properties of existence, which already started in earlier Kalam and philosophical works. So works by Gerjani, for example, the Shal Mawakif, which was mentioned earlier, which tends to have this kind of fivefold division, really, of Umur Amma. So you have general properties of existence, you have properties of essences, you have this issue of cause and effect, you have the question of unity and plurality or multiplicity, and you have this question of eternity and temporality, or eternity and having a beginning. And this is developed through various works and commentaries until it comes to the time of Mir Damad. What happens then in Mir Damad is you have an extensive discussion of the general properties of existence, precisely where you have the development of this quantifier theory of what existence is, the reference of existence. But you also have the extensive discussion of this question of huduth, of the beginning of the cosmos, and whether, at what kind of ontological level does that beginning happen? Does it happen in this kind of realm of eternity, or does it happen in temporality, or does it happen in this median area of perpetuity, or dahar, which is where the mutable and the immutable, the eternal and the temporal meet? And by locating this argument about the existence of the cosmos and its incipience within that, he very much made it an absolutely central question of debate within metaphysics, whereas it tended before him to be primarily something which was being debated in philosophical theology. That's, I think, one thing which is quite important about the conception of metaphysics in both Mullah Sadra and Mir Damad, which is then, I think, broadly rejected in the Dars-e-Nizami, although there's a question about how you do this, but that the concept of metaphysics brings in a number of debates which previously had been taking place mainly in theological works, whether that's about the existence of God or whether that's about the existence of the cosmos and God's creative agency. And so if I kind of quickly summarize maybe some of the key contributions of Mir Damad and then his school in terms of the conception of metaphysics, they would be, broadly speaking, this. And I've got a list of about 12 things which are overlapping, and I'll just mention some of them because we don't really have time to go into all of them. So one would be this point I'd already made, which is that existence and essence, well, existence is not really a property or real property of contingent beings, but rather it's just a quantifier with respect to them, whereas for God, it is something real. Entities that we pick out in experimental reality are primarily instantiations of essences. Whereas for God, essence and existence are entirely identical. And existence is something meaningful, which is predicated of God. In that way, then existence with respect to contingent beings is an accident of essence. It's secondary. And this is what, this later Iranian debate about what is prior, what has asala, existence or essence. Clear from this, the implication is that Mir Damad supports the view of what's known as asalatul mahiyya, or the primacy of essence and not of existence, whereas his student Mullah Sadra has the opposite position. So existence, therefore, is merely the actualization of the individuation of the thing, its quantification, and nothing else. Essences themselves, of course, are constituents of divine knowledge. And hence, essences are then made by God, who gives them, who instantiates them. And in that sense, they are those things which are, the word literally is kind of made, or which emanate from God. And this is this idea of what is maj'ul, what is produced out of a process of ja'al. Essences in their non-actualized form continue to have a reality in the mind of God, so to speak. And this is this ontological sphere, which is quite significant in all sorts of debates, but especially debates actually in jurisprudence, which is a sphere which we might call nafs al-amr. Nafs al-amr, literally the thing in itself, is quite a difficult concept to translate, but sometimes some colleagues translate as the notion of objectivity. What is something in its objective reality? Some would argue that nafs al-amr is this notion of the truth maker. A truth maker is something which gives truth validity to the entities that it picks out and refers to. There are other ways in which we might render nafs al-amr. Of course, the significant kind of punchline of all these things is that, as I mentioned, existence is not a real predicate or a real property of anything. It is the mere fact of the individuation and identification of an essence as a thing. Right. Now, I should really move on to the second school and start to then move towards some sort of conclusion. Apologies for going over time. Moving to Mir Damad's student, Mullah Sadra, there are a number of positions that he takes in metaphysics, which then also get taken up by those discussing things in the Dars-e-Nizami. And incidentally, of course, if you want some further kind of discussions of these things, I would point to this article I published on the debate on creation in the Journal of the American Oriental Society back in 2010 on Mir Damad and John Puri. On Mullah Sadra, of course, I've written extensively on his metaphysics, including a book called Mullah Sadra Metaphysics. And on Mir Damad, I also have an article forthcoming on on his conception of metaphysics. But to summarize, in a sense, what Mullah Sadr's ideas were with respect to metaphysics, I would say that these. Contrary to the position of Mir Damad, for Sadra, existence is what is most apparent and what is fundamental in extramental reality. As such, it cannot be defined, but it's broadly given. Existence is something which is objectively true. It is a real predicate and a reality that obtains an extramental reality. It is what is made by God and emanates from God. So on this question of ja'al, or what is maj'ul, it's existence and not essence, contrary to Mir Damad. Existence is what individuates particulars that manifest a certain essence. Existence is not a mere quantifier as it is in Mir Damad. Existence also undergoes a process of what is known as modulation or tashkik. And this issue of tashkik was very important. It's one of the key contributions of Mullah Sadra, and it's also one of the things that was most extensively debated. And by modulation, what we mean is that existence, reality, is a singular entity, but it is differentiated. The differentiation and the multiplicity that we experience is very much arises out of different intensities, different modulations within that singularity of existence. So it's not a simple monism in which there is only one thing that exists, but rather it is a monism or about the singularity of existence, which is then differentiated by different intensities of existence. And that alongside that is perhaps the third kind of important position in metaphysics that Mullah Sadra has, which is that everything that exists is in this constant state of flux, of developing, of changing, of becoming. And this is usually when we talk about Mullah Sadra, we're talking about his notion of motion and substance, or motion in the category of substance. In Arabic, this is the term haraka jawhariya or harakat jawhari in Persian. And this is usually discussed with respect to the nature of the human soul. So the human soul is this constant process of becoming, but that existence in itself is not stable. It's not constant in that way. This is not a view, for example, an Aristotelian view of what substances are. In Aristotle, of course, substances are defined by their fixity and stability. In Mullah Sadra, and arguably this is also taking up an important theme in late Neoplatonism, existence is primarily marked by its dynamic and by its flux. This is why it's so difficult to grasp existence and why it's so difficult to define existence, because once you've done that, you in a sense reify and try to make fixed and stable something which in itself is not fixed and stable. And the last element of the metaphysics which I want to just indicate, which relates to Sadra's response perhaps to Mir Damad's position on creation, is that he agrees broadly with the philosophical doctrine of Avicenna, etc., that the cosmos is just a logical result of God. It's not created in time as such, but through this process of becoming, through this haraka jawhariya, through this motion in the category of substance, it is constantly being renewed and recreated. Now, this is not, for example, the Ash'ari Sunni theological idea of occasionalism, in which entities in and of themselves, come in and out of existence at every instant, and they need to be recreated by God in every instance. That's not the point. The point here is that the renewal, the constant renewal and the constant becoming of entities within the cosmos is a function which is kind of hardwired into their very being. It's not that they need and they can only have God as the singular and only cause of that process at all time and all points and instance of time. Now, I'm just aware that I've only been going almost for an hour, so I should really wrap up. I could have said a few things about some of the specific texts. I won't say anything more about the specific texts, but let me just say something about the reception of these schools and maybe tie it up. I think the important thing to note here is that, you know, as I mentioned, there is very much a school of Malasadva in the Hindustani context. This is not just about the commentaries on the Sadhva or the Sharh al-Hidayah of his work. I mean, as I mentioned, there are well over 100 commentaries on this. There was a work which Akbar Subut published in Persian almost 20 years ago called Filsuf-e Shiraz dar Hind, in which he goes through the various biographical dictionaries to show this nature of the inheritance. But rather, there was a wider, the Sharh al-Hidayah in itself does not necessarily represent the totality of his metaphysical teachings. In fact, what we then find when we look at the commentaries, when we look at other texts and commentaries and some of the original works which were written in the Dars-e-Nizami milieu, we find references to Malasadas' major works. So here we primarily mean things like the works such as the Four Journeys, Al-Asfar al-Arba, Al-Hikmah al-Muta'aliya fi al-Asfar al-Aqliya al-Arba, which is his major work, 9 volumes in the modern edition, which is the totality of his teachings on everything from metaphysics to the nature of the course of the human soul and in its afterlife, as well as other works such as his commentaries on his exegesis of the Quran, his commentaries on the Shi'i hadith traditions in Usul al-Kafi, his Ashawahid al-Rububiyyah, another important kind of summary of his metaphysics and philosophy. So there's a much wider sense in which the engagement with Mullah Sadva's thought and with seeing him as a dominant reading actually of Ibn Sina is something which is extensively debated in the Dars-e-Nizami. On the side of Mir Damad, as I mentioned before, it's somewhat more of a historical relic. It seems to have more resonances in the continuing Iranian tradition into the modern period. But beyond certain usages of it, you know, for example, with respect to the quantifier and with looking at elements of predicate logic in some of the logic texts, we don't see much resonance of it. And in fact, it seems on the other elements of his metaphysics, there's his reading of Avicenna is broadly that which is rejected. So I think the last thing I would say, and just to kind of link it to further possibilities of how we might take that research and those connections forward. One of the areas I'm quite interested in also is how the teaching of philosophy, the milieu of philosophy, then intersects with other kinds of disciplines. And in particular, I'm thinking also of things like poetry. I personally am quite interested in the poetry of Bedil and how Bedil acts as a rather interesting ground for different kinds of intellectual encounter, as well as poetics. And then, of course, you've got the wider milieu of what sometimes is called the Delhi Renaissance. And by Delhi Renaissance, we mean figures such as Momin, such as Shifta, such as Ghalib, of course, as well as Fazl Khairabadi. So, you know, I think even maybe looking at how it is that these philosophical ideas are then expressed and distilled and developed even in the poetic traditions is something which is really worth taking up as a part of the kind of informal sense of Dars-e-Nizami. And as I said, for that, I think Ghalib may well be the main conduit. And that's also, I think, perhaps why I'm interested in this kind of broader connection taking us from Bedil to Ghalib. But that, of course, would be a different paper for a different time. So I hope I raised lots of questions, which hopefully will be the further development of this conversation. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much for this extensive survey and analysis of the robust interactions among philosophers, and most important thing, the way you simplified it. Now there is another section in which we allow our speaker, our participants to directly ask questions. So if you have any question, please go ahead.
Maybe in terms of
Facebook, Anas?
shall I ask something?
So this question is posted by Hina Ansari via Facebook.
Okay. Sir,
And it's actually
yeah.
asked by, sorry. She says, could you please elaborate more on the need to devise Dars-e-Nizami and its emphasis on maqulat? Also, what was the previous system of Dars?
So yes, that's a very interesting question. This question of why maqulat, why the emphasis of maqulat is an important one, and it's still one which I guess there's no singular answer for that. What I would say is that the point I try to indicate that this was about the training of people who would be useful for imperial service, I think is a very important element of it. And that and the maqulat is a broad training of not just things that you can take out into the world and for imperial service, but then becomes a set of tools that you can apply even for the study of scripture. So, if people were merely being trained in the manqulat, as they're called, things like hadith, things like Quranic exegesis, things like fiqh, the law, that still begs the question of how you study these things, right? What sort of hermeneutics do you use? What sort of tools do you need for reading? What assumptions do you have about the nature of language, about how language refers, and so forth? And these are precisely the sorts of hermeneutical tools that the Dars-e-Nizami, with its emphasis on maqulat, presents. It gives you those tools which you can then apply in the manqulat. And yes, it didn't come out of a vacuum. So the very fact that there's a very strong inheritance of what I call the Shirazi tradition from the 15th century is demonstrated in this kind of constructed genealogy. I say constructed genealogy because genealogies are never that straightforward of any type. But there's this kind of constructed genealogy which takes you from Mullah Nizamuddin, the so-called founder, Bani Dars-e-Nizami, in the title of the famous work by Mufti Raza Ansari. There's a certain kind of inheritance which goes back to Fathullah Shirazi, who was prominent at the court of Akbar. And he himself came out of the Shirazi tradition directly himself. So, from him to various, to his students, going down to Mullah Nizamuddin. And already within that, there is this kind of emphasis on the maqulat. So you could argue that within the Shirazi tradition, the emphasis on the maqulat is then what is taken up in the Dars-e-Nizami. Perhaps the one thing which is somewhat interestingly different from the Shiraz school to the Dars-e-Nizami is the way in which theological affiliation is dealt with. So, of course, in the Shiraz school, you had both Sunni and Shi'i theologians. And certainly by the end of the Shiraz school, or one very important element of the Shiraz school, it becomes very Shi'i. And then in its inheritance, both in Mir Damad and in Malasadas, it's very much a Shi'i inheritance as well. Whereas the Dars-e-Nizami is tries to retain some element of neutrality on the question of theology. So we do know that in the 18th and 19th century onwards, in Lucknow and other places, despite Lucknow, of course, being a Shi'i kind of dominant space, Dars-e-Nizami was not, of course, a Shi'i curriculum, but it was relatively neutral to that. It was about discussing kind of general issues on metaphysics and the tools that you would then use in the study of texts, but it wasn't necessarily neutral in that way. There, of course, is another argument for saying that for some of the Farangi Mahallis, this was an attempt to reinscribe or perhaps to recover the maqulat for the Sunni tradition. So some of the texts like the Ojala Nafi'a, etc., seem to make this argument that it's very important for the Sunni tradition, for the community, to understand that the philosophical traditions are very much part of their inheritance. And perhaps that's a sense in which that was being lost in the wider milieu, in that we're certainly in the Iranian context, philosophy was very much the domain of Shia thinkers in particular. So there is that element, but the way in which the maqulat is considered, the difference between the Shiraz school and then up to Lucknow, I think that's a significant one. And we're still in this moment where the maqulat in different parts of the Muslim world are controversial, right? So for different reasons, some of them actually can be sectarian theological reasons, but also the relative importance of the maqulat and manqulat is something which I think remains very much a matter of debate. And this is why the contemporary Dars-e-Nizami, as I'm sure you know, there are many contexts both in Hindustan but also in the diasporas where people allegedly are studying the Dars-e-Nizami. I'm not really sure what they mean by this anymore, because on the whole they're certainly not studying the maqulat, or rather the maqulat is very much reduced within that. Now, of course, what Dars they had in other areas like hadith, etc., I'm not really qualified to talk about that. The people who work on hadith in South Asia who would be much better qualified to do that. And you've got this whole other issue of, what might have been going on in the Deccan, what might have been happening earlier in other parts in Gujarat and Bengal. Certainly in the Deccan, the interesting thing, as we do know, is that in the pre-Dars-e-Nizami tradition, 16th, 17th century, the Deccan was broadly a Shi'i theological space. And the interesting thing there is the way in which Shia theology is primarily inflected in Persian. So the earliest translations actually we have, or the developments of Shia theological works in Persian, are actually done in the Deccan and not in Iran. Translations of the classical tradition, translations of classical fiqh texts, hadith works, Quranic commentary, even one of the most interesting commentaries on the Nahj al-Balagha, this famous literary anthology attributed to Amir al-Mu'mineen, is produced by Nizamuddin Gilani in the Deccan, in Hyderabad. And it's a wonderful example of a commentary which is in the mixture of Arabic and Persian, and is extant in, I think, something like 3 manuscripts or 2 manuscripts. The main manuscript is in Salar Jung in Hyderabad. So yeah, sorry, I went on a bit, but
we have another question from Facebook. You speak about the modern distinction that is drawn between philosophy and poetry. Does it make sense to think of pre-modern ilm or knowledge paradigm over modern European disciplinary categories like philosophy separated from other forms of knowledge? One might even say poetry is the language of philosophy in Indo-Islamic knowledge tradition.
So I very much agree with that sentiment. I think one of the features of what's sometimes called the early modern period is precisely the way in which some of these generic boundaries do not work extremely well. It certainly is the case that poetry is a very important vehicle for the encounter of different modes of intellectual inquiry. And I gave the example of Bedil. I think Bedil is a wonderful sort of exemplar of this in the 17th century. At the same time, I think we need to be slightly careful. It's not just, you do have this famous kind of post-philosophy critique, which is basically says, well, philosophy is just a mode of literary production, like any other literary production. You should just be studying literature, regardless of how we define it generically. But I think it's, there is a sense in which there are different modes of persuasion and discourse at play. So to entirely take the poetics element out of poetry and just say that it is a versified form of philosophy, I think would also be problematic. So it's not that I disagree that poetry often is the language or the mode of expression of philosophy. It's just that, I do want to retain the aesthetics and the poetics there as well. So, for me, Bedil is not just philosophy. Bedil is also wonderful poetry, right? That's the point. So Ghalib is not just philosophy, but Ghalib is also very good poetry. Yes, and I think that has a lot to do with how our modern kind of disciplinary boundaries work. But then we do need to think about what the nature of expression is, what the nature of language is, what the nature of persuasion is, an argument at play. And certainly it is possible to actually, as we know, going back to the Aristotelian tradition, to place poetry even as, or the poetics as a branch of logic. We know this from the reception of Aristotle already in the early Arabic period, that the poetics and the rhetoric was part of the organon. It was part of logic. It was part of the arts of persuasion. And in that sense, one should understand them as being much closely connected. Poetry is not just the affective, right? It's not just kind of the emotive. It's not just the irrational. It's kind of very misleading to see things in those terms. And that's perhaps one of the elements of the kind of decolonization of these sorts of categories and disciplines that are required, is to see kind of poetry in this much more connected way.
Rizvi sir, sorry, I interrupted. Yeah, yes, sir.
Yeah, no. This is such an interesting lecture, Sajjad, and so many interesting wide connections that you are showing, and the Indian connections in terms of the 18th, 19th centuries with the 16th, 17th century Iranian, Shiraz school of philosophy. So I'm just thinking of the kind of things that you have said have wide ramifications across fields. You just mentioned about poetry of the kind that reflects on, Wahdatul Wujud kind of position. But also there are, from the 15th, 16th century referred to Vedanta, yoga kind. So the Chishti Sabri, for instance, position on, Islamic appropriation and interpretation of the yoga, of the kind of work, Carl Ernst has done with reference to the Persian and Arabic translations of Amrit Kund, Hawzul Hayat, Barul Hayat, etc. And in that context, the possibility of thinking about the difference between Tawheed on the one hand and Wahdatul Wujud on the other, and therefore there was some tension between the theological position of Tawheed and maybe Sufi position on Wahdatul Wujud, etc. The other interesting thing in terms of time is that the 10th, 11th, 12th century old Arabic philosophy and its appropriation subsequently in the making of early modern Europe is an interesting proposition. But at the time when Europe is sort of adapting, appropriating the older, sciences, philosophies, etc. In the 16th, 17th century, Shiraz kind of discussion and debates are taking place, and that is once again coming to India in the 17th, 18th century. So, but then I was also thinking in terms of what transformations would be possible in terms of perhaps from medieval to early modern, from early modern to colonial modern. But then we also have, as I mentioned, Ghalib, kind of personality. So whether colonial modern in the 19th century in India created a major break, as it were, from the 18th century position into the 19th century, and if that, how that actually affected thinking about things, philosophical, theological, or in this case, questions of metaphysics, etc. And in this context, I was thinking about, you can certainly speak for hours on this. This work by Muhammad Tawakkuli Targhi on refashioning Islam or refashioning Iran, and I'm just remembering that how he has written about 18th century intellectual history, 18th century centers in India compared with 18th century centers in other parts of the Islamic world, and what might have been the situation like in the contemporary Western cities like maybe London and Paris in the same period, and and whether in any way 18th century India or the Islamic world was inferior to Europe at that time, perhaps not. So then what went wrong, as it were, as we keep saying, for the Islamic world in the subsequent period, and then, colonialism, etc. And what is your, sort of elaboration on this further?
Yeah, so that I think there are at least 4 questions there, but let me try and work through them. I think at the heart of it, the question is basically, it seems that in the earlier period you have different kinds of encounters based on, I guess, kind of the meeting of equals, whereas in the later period, its power relations start to become much more telling, right, and determinant of the way in which the encounter works, right? So, for example, in the early period, we think of, you mentioned the interaction of the school of Ibn Arabi through the Chishtis with the Yoga Vedanta tradition. And, we think of works such as, I can never remember if it's Faizi or Abul Fazl, Sharik al-Ma'rifat, which is basically this kind of Persian version of the Vedanta Sara text, which is a wonderfully interesting short text in Persian, even earlier than Dar al-Shukr or Abdul Rahman Chishti. So you have that sort of encounter, and then the work which not just Collins but also Shankar Nair's wonderful work translating wisdom deals with that. But then, yes, what happens later? And the one other kind of encounter which is worth mentioning, and again, this is very little studied, is some of the earlier elements of the encounter between European philosophies and philosophies in Hindustan. So I'm thinking primarily of François Bernier. So François Bernier, of course, was a close disciple of Pierre Gassendi. He was also, a part of the Salon of Danishmand Khan. And we do know that he discussed philosophy with people, Ishraqis. He discussed philosophy possibly with some Navyanaya philosophers in that period as well, certainly Yogins. That would be a really interesting research project to look at what's going on there. So not just the kind of so-called Islamic and Hindu, which again I have problems with these things because I don't want to say that Islamic is one thing and Indian is another thing. For me, that doesn't make much sense, precisely because I'm against the Arabocentrism of this whole thing. But yeah, how does it then engage with elements of European thought coming through? And it's not just through people like Gassendi, but it's also the Jesuits and many other thinkers who are coming through, early missionary works, even before you get the very significant work of Henry Martyn, you know, at the turn of the 19th century. And then, of course, you get the colonial break. So one of the elements of the colonial break is what's known as epistemicide, right? So epistemicide works in lots of different ways. One is the destruction of institutions. The other one is the destruction, of course, of people who can teach these things. And the third element is the destruction of the archive, right? I'm sure you're all familiar with the fact that one of the best archives of Islamic manuscripts from Hindustan is in London, and it is not an accident that it is in London. It's a willful expression of that epistemicide that it is in London. And then what remains, of course, in Hindustan is kind of scattered in different ways, with different levels, as I'm sure you're familiar with, different levels of obstacle in accessing those materials as well. Unfortunately, open access is still not something which is really happening in modern India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, etc. Now, the epistemicide, of course, is then also related to this thing about decline. So, you know, there is this idea that you know, you had the metaphysical turn under Descartes. You had the rise of the self, the Promethean self, especially in the Enlightenment. You had the scientific revolution in the 17th century, and all these things gave you know, the West some sort of competitive edge over other parts of the world, and the rise of the West through the mechanical shift, the metaphysical shift, the scientific shift, was coupled with this decline in other places. And what I think that doesn't necessarily take into consideration is the way in which there were still conversations going on. Now, the epistemicide in places like Hindustan was much greater than Iran. In Iran, you had the continuation of this philosophical mode. You had the continuation of the study of metaphysics, you know, well into the 20th century. And even what we do know is that even when one of the things I'm kind of interested in nowadays is modern philosophy, and tracing the way in which philosophy is studied in these modern contexts. If you look at the establishment of the Department of Philosophy at the University of Tehran and the early period of the teaching of philosophy, what you see is a much greater sense of bringing European or Western philosophy into conversation with philosophical traditions which still existed in Tehran, right? So you still had people in Tehran at the same time as the philosophy department and the Danishgah Manqul wa Ma'qul was established. You still had people in the madrasas who were teaching this stuff. And they were writing textbooks for their students in the university. So you had people like Fazl Tuni, you had people like Sayyid Kazim Assar, Mehdi Alai Qumshahi, Mehdi Hadi Yazdi. They all wrote textbooks on metaphysics, which were presenting basically the school of Malasadas, but bringing it into conversation with Kant, bringing it to conversation with what's I've got blank now, French philosopher, can't remember now. Anyway, with trends in French philosophy in the early part of the 20th century, which influenced Henri Bergson, you know, famously Iqbal wrote this work of, you know, Bedil through the eyes of Bergson, which is a very strange book. But it's, you know, in the early part of the 20th century, in Persian context, Henri Bergson's philosophy was very popular, not just in Iran, but also amongst people who read Persian in Central Asia and in Hindustan as well. So that element of the debate was ongoing. And in places like Iran, that continues. So, you know, practically every work of philosophy imaginable gets translated into Persian, right, even nowadays. How much of that gets translated into Urdu or Hindi? Or, I have no idea. I can say that from what I'm familiar with, hardly anything gets translated into Urdu. And I don't know about other languages across modern South Asia. But it's not just about the translation, because of course, in modern South Asia, post-colonial South Asia, English is very much a medium for the engagement with philosophy. But it's, to what extent is that encounter still the case? Or is it merely the case of a colonialist epistemology having taken over in such a way that no one's, realistically engaging, and maybe kind of indigenous modes of knowledge production and philosophy have become displaced? So if you want to do serious, Islamic philosophy from Hindustan, or serious modes of other Indian philosophies, you do it in places like Harvard and Chicago and Columbia and Oxford and places like that. I don't know what's happening in places like Delhi or Calcutta, etc. Are those traditions surviving? And even if they were maybe in the 1960s or whatever, are they still the case? So the question of decline cannot be separated from epistemicide, right? And one of the things I think we need to do with decoloniality and decolonization is not just to recover. It's not just a question of recovering tradition. It's also critically engaging with traditions and thinking about what possible futures we want. I mean, this is me not speaking as historian anymore, right? It's not, history, I think, has an important part to play in that, because it's about understanding the language that we have established for talking about these things. But if we're thinking about what decolonial studies calls the pluriversal options and futures, we need to engage with these multiple traditions and look forward to how we do these things. Where is, for example, the new Sharikul Ma'arifat Vedanta Sara kind of texts, and where might that take us in the future? It shouldn't just be a question of just recovering or just translating these texts into modern parlance or to modern vernaculars, but it's also, what do we want out of philosophy, which remains, I was going to say authentic, I'm not even sure the question is authentic, but remains rooted in the embodiment of our present, right? Which is meaningful for our present context. I personally think this is precisely why philosophy is so important in modern South Asia, right? Insofar as philosophy is this reflection on where we are, where we want to go to. And where we want to go to, which recognizes our embodiment, which recognizes that we are not just disembodied minds, that we are interconnected, that we do want to produce in a collective manner a future which is about flourishing. Old-fashioned Aristotelian idea of eudaimonia or sa'adat, as it would be in the Arabic Persian context. Ethical formation. I think that's what education should be about. Old-fashioned idea, I know.
Okay, thank you so much, sir, for your brilliant talk. And there are no more questions, sir, so I think this is right time to call off the session now. So, sir, Raji, will you say some words?
No, I just want to thank Sajjad for such an interesting exposition on what is not being done and what happened in the past. So thanks very much.
No, thank you. And I look forward to meeting in person, inshallah, in some time. We can make it over to Delhi again. It'd be lovely to do this sort of talk in person.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye.